Born deaf in a brutal world, Northern Alpha King Sterling ruled in absolute silence. Enemies called his affliction a curse, while his beta called it a tragedy. But when one lowly maid stumbled upon a hidden journal, she realized this powerful monarch wasn't cursed. He was being systematically poisoned. In the brutal, unforgiving hierarchy of the Northern Pacts, physical weakness was an automatic death sentence. To be born blind, lame, or deaf meant you were quietly left for the winter storms to claim. Yet, Sterling Ashford survived. Born completely deaf, the heir to the Blackwood Pack was shielded only by his father's immense, terrifying power. When his father was murdered in a border skirmish, a teenage Sterling ascended to the throne. He didn't rule with his voice. He ruled with his claws, his sheer size, and an uncanny ability to read the vibrations of a room. He could feel the heavy, frantic heartbeat of a liar through the stone floorboards. He could smell the acrid stench of treason before a sword was even drawn. Sterling became known as the Silent King. He was a ruthless, isolated monarch who communicated solely through a complex series of hand gestures and written decrees. But a king who cannot hear the whispers of his court is a king who is inherently vulnerable. Enter Silas Montgomery. Silas was Sterling's beta, his childhood companion, and most importantly, his voice. Silas was the only man permitted to translate the king's rapid hand speak to the Pack Council, the visiting lords, and the terrified servants. To the outside world, Silas was the devoted right-hand man, selflessly dedicating his life to interpreting the will of a disabled alpha. Then came Genevieve Hayes. Genevieve, known as Gwen to the few friends she had left, was not a werewolf. She was a human from the impoverished human settlement of Oakhaven, seeking work at Blackwood Keep to pay off the crippling debts left by her late father, Thomas Hayes. She was hired as a scullery maid, tasked with polishing the heavy silver goblets and scrubbing the blood from the Great Hall's flagstones after the wolves had their raucous feasts. She was warned on her first day by Arthur Pendleton, the strict head butler. Never look the king in the eye, never speak in his presence, and never, under any circumstances, drop anything. He may be deaf, but he feels the crash in his bones, and his temper is legendary. Gwen kept her head down. She was invisible, a ghost flitting through the damp, shadow-draped corridors of the keep. But Gwen possessed a secret skill. Her younger brother, whom she had lost to the winter fever years ago, had also been born deaf. To communicate with him, Gwen had mastered the old realm's sign language, the exact same ancestral hand-speak Sterling used. She was also an expert at reading lips, her quiet existence shattered during a tense diplomatic dinner in her third week. Lord Gregory Walsh of the neighboring Red Creek Pack had come to negotiate a trade treaty. The winter had been harsh and Red Creek was starving. Gwen was assigned to pour wine, instructed to remain a silent fixture against the stone wall. She watched as Lord Walsh, a proud but desperate man, pleaded for access to Blackwood's western hunting grounds. Sterling sat at the head of the heavy oak table, his broad shoulders tense, his piercing ice-blue eyes fixed on Walsh. The king raised his large, scarred hands and began to sign. Gwen watched his fingers move with fluid, empathetic grace. "Your people will not starve," Sterling signed. "We will open the western borders. Send your hunters tomorrow. We share the winter. We share the meat." Gwen smiled softly into her collar. The Silent King was not the monster the rumors claimed. He was generous. But then, Silas Montgomery stood up to translate. Silas's face was arranged in a mask of haughty disdain. "The Alpha King says," Silas announced, his voice booming across the great hall, "that your weakness is not his concern. If Red Creek cannot feed its own, it deserves to starve. The western borders remain closed. Any of your hunters caught crossing the line will be executed and their heads sent back to your pregnant wife." Gwen froze. The heavy crystal wine pitcher in her hands trembled. She looked at Sterling. The Alpha King was watching Lord Walsh's reaction, expecting relief and gratitude. Instead, he saw Walsh's face contort into a mask of pure, humiliated rage. Walsh spat at the foot of the table, cursed the Blackwood name, and stormed out of the hall. Stirling looked genuinely confused, a flicker of hurt crossing his stoic features, before his expression hardened back into a cold mask. He turned to Silas, signing rapidly. "Why is he angry? Did I insult his pride?" Silas sighed heavily, playing the part of the weary adviser. "He is an arrogant fool, my king," Silas said aloud, while simultaneously signing back a fabricated translation. "He demanded our eastern territories as well. He insulted your late father. I had to dismiss him." Gwen felt the blood drain from her face. The beta wasn't translating. He was rewriting the king's words. He was deliberately isolating Stirling, turning allies into enemies, and ruling the pack through a puppet monarch who had no idea he was being manipulated. Silas Montgomery was the true tyrant of Blackwood Keep. In that terrifying moment, as Silas's dark eyes swept the room and briefly locked onto hers, Gwen realized she was standing on a precipice. She knew the most dangerous secret in the kingdom. If Silas ever found out she understood the hand speak, she would be dead before morning. For 2 weeks, Gwen lived in a state of paralyzing fear. Every time Silas walked past her in the corridors, the scent of his expensive bergamot cologne made her stomach churn. She began to closely observe the political dynamics of the keep. It was a horrifying revelation. Every tax increase that crushed the lower villages, every execution of a supposed traitor, every cruel decree, they were all Silas. Stirling would sign for mercy, for patience, for investigation, and Silas would translate it into a demand for blood. The Alpha King was a prisoner, trapped behind a wall of silence, completely reliant on a traitor. Gwen knew she had to warn him. But how? She couldn't simply walk up to the king. He was constantly guarded, and Silas rarely left his side. If she tried to write a letter, it would be intercepted by Silas's spies, who controlled all correspondence entering and leaving the royal chambers. Her opportunity arose by pure, unadulterated chance. Because of her meticulous work ethic, the head butler promoted Gwen to dust the royal library, specifically the restricted western wing. This section of the keep held the historical ledgers, ancient pack treaties, and the private journals of past royal advisers. It was a dusty, forgotten mausoleum of paper and leather. Late one Tuesday night, while scrubbing the soot from the grand fireplace in the corner of the room, Gwen leaned her weight against a stone gargoyle carved into the mantel. With a grinding click, a hollow compartment in the stonework popped open. Inside lay a small, black, leather-bound diary, its edges crumbling with age. The gold-leaf lettering on the cover was faded, but readable. The private medical logs of Dr. Arthur Penhaligon, royal healer to the Blackwood pack. Gwen knew that name. Dr. Penhaligon had been the physician who delivered Stirling. He had died in a mysterious carriage accident shortly after the king's birth. Her curiosity overriding her fear, Gwen opened the brittle pages. The first few entries were mundane records of herbal poultices and childbirths, but as she reached the dates corresponding to Stirling's birth 26 years ago, the handwriting grew frantic and erratic. October 14th. The infant Alpha is strong, but something is terribly wrong. He does not startle at loud noises. He does not react to his mother's voice. Lord Frederick Montgomery, Silas's father, insists it is a congenital defect, a tragedy, he calls it. But tonight, while examining the child in secret, I found the truth. There is a faint, dark aura emanating from the child's tympanic cavities. Upon magical magnification, I saw them. Microscopic shards of crystallized wolfsbane, coated in silver ash resin, have been surgically embedded deep within the ear canals. This is dark magic. The shards are not merely deafening the boy. They are paralyzing his auditory nerves and actively suppressing his wolf's healing factor in that localized area. He He was not born deaf. He is being poisoned. Lord Montgomery did this to ensure the heir would always be reliant on his own son, Silas. I must tell the old king. I must find the weeping moon tree sap to dissolve the resin, though it requires the touch of a true mate to fully heal the necrotic nerve damage. I will present this to the king tomorrow. The diary ended there. Dr. Penhaligon had been murdered before he could reveal the truth. Gwen sat on the cold library floor, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a sob. The sheer cruelty of it was staggering. For 26 years, Sterling had lived in a silent void, believing himself to be broken, defective, a burden. He had endured the ridicule of his enemies and the pity of his pack, all because of a parasitic shard of silver and poison lodged in his skull. He wasn't cursed. He was unbroken. He just needed to be freed. Gwen hid the diary in the bodice of her coarse linen dress. The stakes had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just about Silas lying to the council. This was about the physical mutilation of an alpha. She could no longer wait for a safe opportunity. She had to create one. That night, she volunteered to take the king's evening tea to his private bedchambers, a task usually reserved for the senior maids. She laced the tea of the 2 guards stationed outside his door with a heavy dose of valerian root stolen from the kitchens. Within 20 minutes, they were slumped against the stone walls, snoring heavily. Her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird, Gwen turned the heavy iron handle and slipped into the king's chambers. The room was vast, lit only by the roaring fire in the hearth. Sterling was standing by the balcony, shirtless, his muscular back covered in the silver scars of a dozen battles. He was staring out at the snow-covered mountains, completely immersed in his silent world. He didn't hear the door open. He didn't hear it click shut as Gwen locked it from the inside. But as Gwen took a step forward, her boot lightly tapping the floorboard, Sterling whipped around. His reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. In a blur of supernatural speed, he crossed the room. Before Gwen could even gasp, a massive, calloused hand clamped around her throat, pinning her violently against the heavy oak door. His ice-blue eyes blazed with feral, protective rage. An assassin in his room. That was his only logical conclusion. Gwen choked, her hands desperately clawing at his iron grip. She couldn't breathe, let alone speak. She realized her fatal miscalculation. She couldn't use sign language if he was strangling her. As the edges of her vision began to darken, she did the only thing she could think of. She went limp, stopped fighting, and stared directly into his furious eyes. With excruciating effort, she exaggerated the movements of her mouth, praying he knew how to read lips as well as she did. "Silas," she mouthed silently. "Lies." Sterling's brow furrowed in confusion. The pressure on her throat eased by a fraction of an inch, just enough for her to drag in a ragged, whistling breath. He glared at her, his eyes darting to her lips, then back to her eyes. He raised his free hand and signed, short and aggressive. "Who sent you? Why are you here?" Gwen lifted her trembling hands. She didn't speak. Instead, she mirrored his language. Her fingers moved clumsily but accurately. "No one sent me," she signed back. "Silas is lying to you. He mistranslates everything you say to the council. You are a prisoner." Sterling froze. The shock that rippled across his face was profound. A scullery maid, communicating with him in the sacred, private language of his ancestors. His grip on her throat loosened entirely, his hand sliding down to grip her shoulder instead to keep her pinned. As his bare skin pressed firmly against the crook of her neck, a sudden, violent jolt of electricity sparked between them. It was as if a lightning bolt had struck the center of the room. The scent of rain and vanilla, Gwen's natural scent, suddenly exploded in Sterling's senses, cutting through the dull, muted grayness of his world like a splash of brilliant color. His pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. The beast beneath his skin roared, slamming against the cage of his ribs. Mate. The word echoed in Sterling's mind, a primal instinct he had long ago convinced himself he would never experience. His breathing hitched. He stared down at the terrified human girl, his thumb subconsciously stroking the pulse point on her neck. Gwen felt the shift in him. The murderous intent had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating intensity that made her knees weak. But she couldn't let herself be distracted. She reached into her bodice and pulled out the crumbling black diary. She pressed it flat against his bare chest, right over his racing heart. She looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes, and signed the words that would burn his world to ash. You were not born deaf, my king. You were poisoned. Sterling stepped back, the ancient diary gripped so tightly in his massive hands that the leather binding groaned. He moved to his heavy mahogany desk, shoving aside maps and military decrees, and laid the brittle pages flat under the glow of a candelabra. Gwen remained frozen by the door, her breathing shallow, watching the Alpha King's face as he read the cramped handwriting of Dr. Penhaligon. She saw the exact moment his world shattered. It wasn't a sudden explosion of rage, it was a terrifying, absolute stillness. The color drained from Sterling's face, leaving his scarred skin the color of ash. His chest stopped rising. He stared at the words, surgically embedded, and Lord Montgomery, until his ice-blue eyes brimmed with unshed tears. For 26 years, he had lived in an agonizing void. He had never heard the crunch of snow under his wolf's paws, the clash of steel in his first victorious battle, or the final, dying breaths of his murdered father. He had blamed the gods. He had blamed his own blood. But it was a cage built by the family he trusted most. Sterling's massive frame began to shake. A low, guttural vibration emanated from his chest, a physical manifestation of a roar that had no sound. He grabbed a heavy iron candlestick and hurled it across the room. It shattered a stained glass window, letting the howling winter wind tear into the bedchamber. Gwen rushed forward, abandoning all protocol and fear. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look down at her. "My king, we must act," she signed, her fingers moving with desperate speed. "Silas has spies everywhere. If he knows I am here, we are both dead." Sterling stared at her, his chest heaving. The intoxicating scent of rain and vanilla, the undeniable scent of his mate, was the only thing grounding him, keeping his inner wolf from tearing the keep apart, stone by stone. He raised his hands, his fingers trembling with suppressed violence. "The diary mentions the weeping moon tree sap," he signed back. "It grows only in the Royal Conservatory, a glass house in the eastern wing." "I know it," Gwen mouthed and signed simultaneously. "I pass it when I fetch firewood. I can get it. But the diary said it requires—" She hesitated, a blush staining her pale cheeks. The touch of a true mate. Sterling reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. The sheer heat of his skin sent a tremor down her spine. "I know what you are, Genevieve. My wolf claimed you the second you stopped fighting me. Go. Quickly." Gwen slipped out of the chamber, navigating the shadowed, labyrinthine corridors of Blackwood Keep. She evaded 2 patrolling sentries and picked the rusted lock of the Eastern Conservatory with a hairpin. The air inside was humid, thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. In the center, bathed in the pale light of the full moon filtering through the frosted glass, stood the weeping moon tree. Its silver bark was slashed with deep, naturally occurring fissures that oozed a glowing, pearlescent sap. Gwen gathered the sap in a small glass vial, her hands shaking, and sprinted back through the stone halls. When she returned, Sterling was sitting on the edge of his bed, shirtless, his jaw clenched in grim anticipation. Gwen knelt beside him. She uncorked the vial. The sap smelled strongly of ozone and crushed mint. "This will burn," she warned him, her hand signing the words before she gently rested her palms on his broad shoulders. I have lived in a burning silence my entire life, Sterling signed back, his eyes locked on hers. Pour it. Gwen tipped the vial, letting 3 heavy, glowing drops fall into his right ear, then repeated the process on the left. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Sterling's eyes rolled back into his head. He violently threw his head back, his spine arching off the mattress as an excruciating, searing pain tore through his skull. The silver ash resin, which had calcified around his auditory nerves for over 2 decades, began to boil and dissolve upon contact with the magical sap. Dark, foul-smelling smoke hissed softly from his ears. Sterling thrashed, his claws extending and tearing into the heavy down mattress. Gwen didn't retreat. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his chest, pressing her skin as tightly against his as possible. "I am here," she whispered aloud, knowing he couldn't hear her yet, but hoping the mate bond would carry her intent. "I'm right here. Fight it, Sterling. Fight it!" The heat radiating between their bodies intensified, glowing with a faint, golden aura. The ancient magic of the werewolf-mate bond surged through Sterling's veins, accelerating his suppressed healing factor. The necrotic tissue in his ear canals, deadened since infancy, began to aggressively regenerate. Microscopic silver shards were pushed out by the rapidly healing flesh, clattering faintly onto the stone floor like tiny grains of black sand. Suddenly, Sterling went entirely rigid. He gasped, a massive, shuddering intake of air, and collapsed forward into Gwen's arms, his heavy body slick with cold sweat. For a long, agonizing minute, the room was perfectly still, save for the crackle of the hearth. Then, Sterling slowly pushed himself up. His eyes, wide and unfocused, darted frantically around the room. He reached up, pressing his hands against his ears. He could hear a strange, rhythmic thumping sound. It was terrifyingly loud, erratic, and drumming right against his chest. It was Gwen's heartbeat. He moved his hands away. He heard the pop of a sap-filled log in the fireplace. He heard the vicious howl of the winter wind whipping through the broken window. And then he heard a sound softer than the rest, fragile and trembling. "Sterling?" Gwen whispered, her voice cracking. The Alpha King looked at her. Tears streamed freely down his scarred face. For the first time in his 26 years of existence, he didn't need to read her lips. He didn't need to look at her hands. "Say my name again," Sterling rasped. His voice was a heavy, gravelly baritone, rough and unpracticed, scraping from a throat that had never been used for speech. It was the most beautiful sound Gwen had ever heard. "Sterling," she sobbed, burying her hands in his dark hair. The Silent King wrapped his massive arms around his mate, burying his face in her neck, and for the first time, he listened to the world. By the time dawn broke over the jagged peaks of the northern mountains, the plan was set. Sterling's hearing was sharper than an average wolf's, overcompensating for decades of disuse. The world was overwhelmingly loud, the scratching of mice in the walls, the distant clatter of pots in the kitchens, the heavy boots of the morning guard, but his focus was razor-sharp. He would not let Silas know he was cured. He needed the traitor to hang himself with his own arrogance. That afternoon, Silas Montgomery convened a grand council in the throne room. Lords from the allied pacts had arrived to finalize the winter taxes. Sterling sat on the Iron Throne, his face an impenetrable mask of stoic indifference. Gwen stood in the shadows near the tapestries, holding a silver tray, her heart in her throat. Silas stood before the assembly, looking resplendent in a fur-lined velvet cloak, playing the part of the weary but noble interpreter. "My lords," Silas announced, his voice projecting across the cavernous room, "the Alpha King has reviewed the yield of the eastern harvest. He finds it severely lacking." Sterling watched Silas's lips move, hearing the lies loud and clear. He raised his hands and signed his true decree. "The winter has been cruel. Taxes will be halved this season to ensure no family goes without firewood or meat. Silas turned back to the crowd, his face grim. "The Alpha King decrees," Silas shouted, "that because of your laziness, the winter tax will be doubled. Any lord who fails to provide the required grain will forfeit their ancestral lands to the crown." A shocked, furious murmur ripped through the assembly. Men gripped the hilts of their swords. A rebellion was brewing right before Stirling's eyes, orchestrated entirely by the man standing beside him. But Silas wasn't done. He turned toward the shadows, pointing a long, gloved finger directly at Gwen. "Furthermore," Silas sneered, his voice dripping with venom, "we have discovered a rat in our keep. This human maid, Genevieve, was found trespassing in the restricted archives last night. She is a spy for the Red Creek Pack. The king has already signed her death warrant." Two massive palace guards stepped forward, grabbing Gwen roughly by the arms and dragging her to the center of the room. She didn't struggle, keeping her eyes locked on Stirling. Silas looked at the king, a smug, patronizing smile on his face. He signed to Stirling. "The human maid stole silver from your chambers. I am making an example of her to show your strength." Stirling didn't sign back. He slowly stood up. The heavy iron legs of his throne scraped loudly against the stone floor. The room fell deathly silent. Silas frowned, his smug facade slipping for a fraction of a second. "My king, please sit. I am handling the vermin." Stirling stepped down from the dais. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he was standing chest to chest with his beta. Silas was a tall man, but Stirling towered over him, a mountain of muscle and suppressed fury. Then the silent king opened his mouth. "You are handling nothing, Montgomery." The voice boomed like rolling thunder, shaking the very dust from the chandeliers. It was deep, commanding, and saturated with the terrifying, suffocating pressure of a true Alpha's command. The entire council hall gasped. Several lords dropped to their knees in sheer shock. The guards holding Gwen instantly released her, stepping back in terror. Silas turned ashen. His eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing horror. He stumbled backward, his knees knocking together. You spoke. You can hear?" "I hear the treason dripping from your tongue," Stirling growled, his voice growing stronger, more resonant with every word. He reached into his tunic and pulled out Dr. Penhaligon's crumbling black diary, tossing it onto the stone floor at Silas's feet. "I hear the ghosts of the men your father murdered. I hear the cries of the packs you have starved in my name. My king, please! It is dark magic, an illusion!" Silas babbled, backing toward the heavy oak doors. "The human witch has cursed you." "The only curse on this keep," Stirling roared, his eyes flashing a brilliant, predatory gold, "was you." In a blur of motion, Stirling lunged. He didn't use a sword. He used his bare hands, hoisting the traitorous beta off the floor by his velvet collar. Silas choked, his feet kicking wildly in the air. Stirling looked out at the stunned assembly of lords. "For 26 years, this man and his father poisoned me, rendering me deaf so they could rule from the shadows. Every cruel decree, every execution, every stolen coin was Silas Montgomery's doing. Today, the silent king speaks, and his first word is justice." With a brutal, effortless heave, Stirling threw Silas across the room. The beta crashed into the stone pillars, knocked unconscious instantly. "Take him to the dungeons," Stirling commanded his elite guard, his voice ringing with unquestionable authority. "He will face the tribunal for high treason." As the guards dragged Silas away, the heavy silence of the room was replaced by a sudden, deafening roar of approval. The lords of the north drew their swords, raising them high, cheering for the true return of the Blackwood Alpha. Stirling ignored them. He turned his back on the cheering lords and walked over to Gwen, who was standing in the center of the hall, trembling but smiling. In front of the entire Northern Council, the terrifying, ruthless Alpha King dropped to one knee. He took Gwen's rough, soap-chapped hands in his own and kissed her knuckles. "And my second decree," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a soft, rumbling purr that only she and every wolf in the room with sharp hearing could catch, "is to introduce you all to Genevieve, my savior, my true mate, and the new Queen of the North." The roar that followed shook the snow from the keep's roof. Sterling stood, pulling Gwen into his arms, finally able to hear the beautiful, erratic rhythm of her heart matching his own. The silence was broken, the winter was ending, and the king had finally found his voice. Did the Alpha King's roar give you chills? If you loved this tale of betrayal, undeniable mate bonds, and ultimate justice, do not leave us in silence. Hit the like button, share this story with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more epic werewolf romance dramas. Your support helps us bring more royal court secrets to life. Drop a comment below with your favorite plot twist.